Hi, everybody. I'm Elliot Cohen, Dean of SAIS, and we're very pleased today to present this webinar, Fostering Connectivity, Infrastructure, Supply Chains, and the Future of Korea's Political Economy. And I want to begin by thanking Dr. Jongil, Dean of the KDI School of Public Policy and Management in South Korea, and Dr. Won-Yuk Lim, who teaches the Korean economy at SAIS, for their efforts. The KDI School of Public Policy and Management is a very valuable partner of SAIS, and we're looking forward to building on an already robust partnership in the future. Our speaker today, Dr. Miyeon Oh, is one of our own. She received her PhD at SAIS. We were talking before this began. She recalls walking by my office all the time on the way to visit with her advisor, Professor Duran. She's also been a visiting scholar here. She's currently the director and senior fellow of the Asia Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. She has a strong background in public policy and international affairs. She's published a great deal. Her research focuses on how geopolitics shapes economic and commercial decisions that require high capital expenditure. For sure, the uncertainty that's been driven by great power competition and shocks like the COVID-19 pandemic is placing new pressures on connecting global and regional infrastructure and supply chains. And of course, we just got a spectacular demonstration of that with the blockage of the Suez Canal by just one ship. How to develop infrastructure networks, how to realign existing supply chains are no longer, if they ever were, purely commercial decisions. They're increasingly being shaped by global geopolitical and national security considerations. And that really is the subject of her expertise. She's also done a great deal of work on Korea's political economy and its relationship to the global and regional economic systems, again, looking at the balance between national security calculations and economic competitiveness. Professor Andrew Mertha, SAIS's Vice Dean for Faculty Affairs, will moderate the Q&A session and lead what I'm sure will be a lively discussion. Dr. Oh, welcome, virtually unfortunately, back to SAIS. The floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Dean Cohen, for your very generous introduction. And it's so great to be back here at SAIS. And it is such an honor to have an opportunity to talk about my research today. As Dean Cohen introduced briefly, I'm currently working for the think tank Atlantic Council as a director for the Asia Security Initiative. And I'd like to quickly say that the mission of the program is to enhance cooperation between the United States and its Asian allies and partners to offer constructive solutions for the most pressing issues affecting the region. While my job really focuses on offering actionable and practical policy recommendations for strengthening the US alliances and partnership, I also find that conducting in-depth academic research should be also a prerequisite to translating research findings into insightful and practical policy recommendations. So I'm delighted to present my research ideas today and looking forward to hearing your thoughts during the Q&A session. So I'm going to share my screen. Great. So today, I'd like to talk about the evolving trend of global and regional connectivity of infrastructure in supply chains by focusing on cross-border oil and natural gas pipelines for infrastructure development and on semiconductor for supply chains. The first topic is what I'm currently transforming my dissertation into a book, building on cases of Sino-Russian oil and natural gas pipelines along with other cases. The second topic is what I'm currently working on in connection with my research project at the Atlantic Council, focusing on Korea and Japan to coordinate with the United States in realigning global supply chains of high-tech industries. I see that the two different lines of research are connected under the underlying overarching questions of how geopolitics shape economic and commercial decisions that require binding deals between countries involving high capital expenditure upfront. Overall, I see that there's growing uncertainty, like Dean Cohen briefly mentioned, driven by changing geopolitical dynamics, such as intensifying US-China tensions, and by unexpected shocks, such as the global COVID-19 pandemic. I see this growing uncertainty has changed the conception of building connectivity throughout the continent and the sea, as well as across the countries. Where to develop infrastructure network, such as a certain pipeline route chosen over other options to connect certain countries, and how to align or realign existing supply chains, such as building a semiconductor plant in certain countries like the United States. So these are no longer purely commercial decisions. Beyond market regions, decisions involving cross-border transactions and investment are increasingly shaped by geopolitical risk and national security calculations. So I'm going to talk about first about cross-border oil and gas pipelines, and then supply chains of semiconductor, as I hope to examine underlying mechanisms of global and regional connectivity. And then as part of the semiconductor research, I'm going to briefly talk about Korea and Korea's political economy, as I hope that my research examines how Korea navigates its opportunities and challenges to balance national security calculations and economic competitiveness in fostering global and regional connectivity. So pipelines. So infrastructure research, my research examines what brings countries into binding cross-border oil and natural gas pipeline deals. And I see that pipelines are considered as an emerging form of strategic energy partnership that enhances energy security in Asia and also Eurasia, because it can circumvent major maritime choke points, such as the South China Sea and the Malacca Strait, through which an increasing share of Asia's oil and natural gas, liquefied natural gas supplies transit. So the cross-border pipelines over the continent link states in long-term relationship between producer states, consumer state, and also transit state. A choice of certain pipeline route over other various options reflect political relations of host countries and their energy security priorities. Major pipeline deals often reveal that energy cooperation between states cannot be just solely justified by purely economic considerations. So in cases where clear economic incentives do not align with strong political motivations, what political economic dynamics bring countries into binding deals? And how do political and economic factors play out interactively in the decision-making regarding cross-border pipeline project? And to what extent do political factors affect commercial viability of large-scale cross-border infrastructure? So for the research, I actually I examined why some proposed pipelines are successful or failed after proposed. And I also look at the number of years since the pipeline is proposed and until the deal is completed. And I examined 4 variables to test my hypothesis. So the first is geopolitical factors. And when a cross-border pipelines project involves support or opposition from third-party countries, or the project go through external shocks or crisis situation, and political trust. So to look at the political alignment between host country government involving the pipeline project. And also I look at the pipeline ownership structure, whether the pipeline ownership is shared by firm from host countries and non-host countries, or just shared by host firms from the host countries. and also whether the fuel type is oil or natural gas. And I conducted mixed method of statistical regressions and case studies coming from Russia to China and also transporting Caspian oil to international markets. And the findings that I have from my research is that geopolitical factors profoundly shape energy relations. And really, regardless of the degree of economic incentive and also the political alignment matter to determine the success of the deal. And also, interestingly, the political economic arrangement affect the likelihood of the successful pipeline deals more significantly in the natural gas than in oil. And I hope that later we can have a chance to talk about this a little more, but I just wanted to quickly point out that the Sino-Russian pipeline case show that the geopolitical changes due to crisis situations have profoundly shaped bilateral energy relations in both oil and natural gas deals. Two countries signed the deal when the relationship between Russia and Western countries were low points, with Russia's annexation with Georgia in 2008 and annexation of Crimea in 2014, etc. And also the external crisis situation like global financial crisis and collapsing oil prices compelled Russia to rely on Chinese capital. So like I said, in the interest of time, I like to move on to the next research of global supply chains. And under the overarching question of how geopolitics shape economic and commercial decisions. So as I mentioned briefly, mounting US-China tensions and the COVID-19 pandemic has led growing calls, both domestically and internationally, to address vulnerabilities in global supply chains critical to national security and economic competitiveness. As the race for global leadership in strategic and emerging technologies intensifies, supply chain policy has become a focus on discussions between the United States and its allies and partners, including Korea, but also both in academia and policy circles. So just would like to briefly explain about the background. And so the Trump administration saw China as a growing and major economic and national security threat because it's increasing regional and global ambitions. Military aggressiveness, global competitiveness in next generation technologies, and unfair trade practices. This concern posed by China led the Trump administration to focus increased attention on global supply chain security and to consider whether, how, and to what extent some form of US economic decoupling from China should occur and existing supply chains should be realigned. And as we know, President Biden's early actions, including the executive orders on America's supply chains, indicate that securing US supply chain to protect national security, address vulnerability, and promote domestic manufacturing will be among his administration's top economic priorities, which is similar to those of the Trump administration. However, the Biden administration is distinguishing itself from the previous one in two ways. One, by focusing on specific sectors or industries that are critical to national security, and to bring in trusted partners to set up informal multilateral frameworks, which galvanize cooperation among democratic allies and partners to build resilient supply chains in critical technologies. So while this set of issues concerning supply chain will continue to evolve, I think it's timely to frame research questions such as what brings countries into binding deals to realign supply chains that require large-scale and long-term investment. And how are decision makers, both governments and firms, defining new risk of changing geopolitics and unexpected shocks to balance national security requirements and economic competitiveness. And for the research, I have these variables as key factors that are driving new risk to global supply chains. And I like to point out briefly that some of the variables are not really new. So it has been also the existing research risk to global supply chain disruptions But the way that I see, so because of the changing geopolitical economic environment, this risk factors have any new element to pose new risk to the global supply chains and disruptions. So one, protectionist pressures and aggressive trade policy by raising tariff and export control measures. And two, geopolitical risk, such as intensifying US-China competition, particularly in high and emerging technologies, and which really converge commercial technology and national security together. And three, supply chain security risk from malign actors compromising global supply chain for information and communication technology and other products and services. And four, unexpected shocks like the COVID-19 pandemic. Then why do I choose semiconductor? Semiconductor represents one of the world's most important industries, the core technology that powers the modern digital world and empowers innovation and productivity growth across every sector of every economy. Recognizing semiconductors' foundational role in modern global economy and their importance to national security, an increasing number of nations are seeking to capture as much value as possible from the industry, and whether from semiconductor research and development, R&D, design, fabrication, or assembly, test, and packaging, ATP. And the semiconductor industry has perhaps the most complex and geographically diverse value chain of any industry in the world. And if you can see from the map, and so the large silicon ingots actually might be produced and cut into silicon wafers in Japan. And those bare wafers shipped to the United States to be transformed into fab wafers and cut into dies, and on which functional integrated circuit is etched to make a semiconductor. Those semiconductor chips then shipped to a country like Malaysia and Vietnam, where the semiconductor chips go through the ATP process, again, assembly, test, and packaging process. Then chips exported to a country such as China, South Korea, or the United States to be integrated to end products such as tablets, mobile phones, or servers, and then those final consumers and products exported to the world. So the typical production process toward the final electronic product, we see that it crosses international borders of 70 or more, and which takes over 100 days and include 3 full trips, global trips. And one of the region which I chose this industry, this is really like global supply chain, unlike other industry like cement or automobiles, which has a high weight. Semiconductors are very small and light, and the cost of moving them around the globe is minimal compared to their actual value. So the research plans to examine how and whether Korea, through case studies, has been realigning its semiconductor supply chains in response to these 4 variables and test which factor is more dominating than the others. And the research aims to investigate whether geopolitical factors are more influential than economic factors, or if it's hard to measure the weight, see how political and economic factors are interactively playing out. And I also plan to conduct, like I said, case studies of Korea's and Japan's semiconductor industries to better understand the ongoing US effort to coordinate with its allies in realigning supply chains. I think my research offers policy implication by tackling the following questions. Like, what role should the government play, and to what extent can or firm, many short-term and long-term risk to balance national security requirement and commercial interests, and how should trusted partners be defined, and what is really desirable allied and multilateral approach to enhancing security and resilience of global high-tech supply chains. And as I briefly mentioned in the beginning, I hope that my research offer ways to better understand how Korea navigates its political economy in fostering global connectivity. And Korea, it's really dynamic country just beyond the security element. And Korea's companies and economy has been really out to many regions, and as you may know, like the current government has a new southern policy, for example. So a lot of companies are already making investment in Vietnam. Is a really good country. So I hope that through my research and I can show how Korea is really navigating, and also for my future research, really expanding to other industries. And for the interest of time, I would like to stop here and actually turn over to Dean Mertha for the Q&A sessions and discussions. Thank you.
Let me just unmute myself. Thank you so much, Dr. Oh. It was fascinating, and there's just a lot of information here for us to sink our teeth into. But before we do that, while we're waiting for the questions to populate, what I'd like to do is also introduce a member of the panel, and that is Professor Jongil, who's the 8th Dean of the KDI School of Public Policy and Management, who has been teaching at KDI since 1998 and who specializes in macroeconomic and development policy. And so I would like to introduce him here and ask him to say a few words, and then we will come back to the question and answer.
Well, thank you for, can you hear me? Thank you for inviting me to this important and interesting, illuminating webinar. Allow me to say how pleased I am with the progress in the cooperation between SAIS and KDI School, and how thankful I am for the efforts and contributions by Dean Cohen and the SAIS faculty. I look forward to further progress in our cooperation. I'm sure addition of capable Korea experts to the SAIS faculty will be a great way to making further progress. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dean Yo. And so what I'd like to do is take the prerogative of asking the first question, or maybe the first two questions. So Dr. Oh, this is a fascinating presentation, and it is one that creates a certain amount of, I don't want to call it post-traumatic stress, but it reminds me of my graduate school days when I worked in the toy business in China, where I was living and breathing supply chains, ostensibly not for microchips, but for plush toys. But one of the things that I recall, or one of the things that does is, it doesn't give me necessarily the kind of distance that I think people who look at this in a more systematic way do. And one of the questions that is always that I was always curious about for people who are really in the nexus of this is to talk about the kind of vulnerabilities that these types of systems are exposed to, and how these types of vulnerabilities may differ from other types of risks, and what that portends moving forward as we enter a somewhat kind of resettling international system. The other question that I have, if I can ask them all at once, has to do with what are the implications that you're able to sketch out at this point? And it must be, by nature, it would have to be preliminary. but what might the impact of if China decides to move forward in its dual circulation strategy? What would that do to some of your findings, and how might that change things in the medium term, at least, and maybe even to the medium and long term? So I know I'm asking you a lot, but I'd be very curious, and I'll mute myself and then move on to the other attendees.
Thank you so much, Dean Mertha, for great questions and very important. And I'll try my best to best answer your question. The first question on disruptions. So because I'm working for the think tank and being a policy community, so suddenly since the pandemic, like think tanks talks about like global supply chain so much. And we just hear so much, and the discussion is really, really like concentrated on the national security. But then for my job, like I do this public events, having, experts from academia and industry, but also I run the private roundtable for the off the record discussion, and where I hear so much from the industry experts that everything cannot be in the bucket of national security, right? And really like trying to find the balance between national security calculations and economic competitiveness. But one thing different in terms of like estimating or measuring the disruptions or element for the disruption, I think the difference between the previous days and nowadays is really, like you said, the China factor and also this pandemic factor, and which really increase the level of the degree of uncertainty. And a lot of business leaders saying that geopolitics matters so much than before, and they have to make decisions not just purely on measuring the profit margins, but they have to really put this national security calculation into account so much. So I think that would be one of the biggest difference. But also when we look at the current policy moving forward, we hear that a couple of days ago, the White House invited some of the global firms to talk about like global supply chains and microchips, etc. So I don't think we haven't seen that so much before, right? And to talk about how really try to like encourage international firms to invest, to reshore, and to increase the supply and the self-sufficiency of the industry is critical to U.S. national security, etc. And I think that can naturally goes to your second questions of what if China actually do more, and we see more visibility in terms of is China's dual circulation strategy. And obviously the focus is on its advanced and emerging technologies, right? And this including semiconductor, electric vehicles, AI, and 5G, etc. So I see that both in the United States really trying to increase self-efficiency here, but then in China also do the same. But the world has been already globalized like so much in many years. So I don't think it's possible to have full self-efficiency in one country. So while countries are going to continue this effort for the time being, I think the countries are and the private firms are positioned really like struggling but navigating like how to balance. That's what I'm just looking at right now for the preliminary finding. I hope that I hope that my research can contribute to existing studies on any literature related to semiconductors, supply chains, also like trade policy, etc. But in order to better understand the current changing geopolitical economic architecture And actually that's shaping a lot, and that would have both policy implications, but also at the same time, for example, I hope that I could write a book on this topic, and not just talking about like Korea's political economy, where it positions itself, but then to better understand Korea in terms of the global political economy.
Terrific, thank you. I know I was kind of putting you on the spot on all of these, very kind of rapidly moving targets along multiple dimensions, but wonderful. Thank you so much. I am going to now turn to our audience, and I've got a few questions here. The first is from my colleague and predecessor as Vice Dean, Professor Kent Calder. And he would like to kind of redirect us back to your presentation to ask about what is the relationship of the first argument, which is to say geopolitics and infrastructure, to related but not quite land-based sectors, meaning marine cables, liquefaction, gasification, et cetera. Does terra firma play a role here in terms of shaping outcomes, or is this kind of more similar than different across these types of physical constraints or challenges?
So as I mentioned briefly, I'm in the process of updating my chapters of dissertation to turn it into a book. So the undersea cables or undersea pipelines were beyond the scope of my research, but because my dissertation was examining the energy relations between particular countries, so I discussed in addition to the specific pipeline deals, what specific energy partnerships the involved country would have, and which includes like equity and upstream. So I think some of that could be related to like LNG and downstream just a little bit. And what I think, so although again, I had to limit my scope of research for the land pipelines because the cases actually cover more than 10 countries because of the transit state. But I really interested in expanding my research into like maritime or undersea infrastructure in a relationship with the digital connectivity, also that we are so much. So President Xi Jinping, he first talked about digital Silk Road, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, from one of the Belt and Road BRI forum. And in addition to this growing, emerging trend of the pipeline network over the continent, we see this growing trend of digital connectivity and in the regions such as Southeast Asia or Africa or Latin America. So I'm really interested in how China has been continuing its effort to build this digital connectivity, but through really its state-owned enterprises, and also how it's been working with state-owned enterprises of the host country government. I hope that I answered Dr. Calder's question.
Thanks very much. The next question that I have here gets more to the buttons and brass tacks of research, and it comes from Harris Vitas, who asks, how do you measure national security considerations in your empirical work? So what variables do you use?
So it's the supply chain research is ongoing, and I'm still in the middle of developing research design into academic setting. So for the policy report, basically I have this multiple definitions of national security, and what I see as a trend is each country has its own definition of national security, and I think it's really important to have one consistent definition for national security, which I think will require some time, because although as a scholar, I can just say that this is what I define in terms of the national security, but I'm in the middle of basically having multiple definitions and talking with the stakeholders and experts what we should basically set up for the national security calculations, so that I can test other like variables and also explanatory variables and uncontrolled variables moving forward. So yeah, that's what I'm doing right now.
I would imagine that that would be even more challenging as you move from, say, scholarly work to the policy world, because it's very, very difficult to avoid tautology, when it comes to that particular measurement. So I think it is, as you suggest, a work in progress for everybody, certainly at least a moving target.
And if
Next question. Oh, please.
Let me quickly jump in. So for the pipeline research, so one of the variables is political trust. So the same question comes to how do you measure political trust? So because my method was mixed, and I basically had to dig out the existing database, and I chose to use the Affinity of Nations Index that is actually pulled from the UN voting data. That so you get to see these numbers actually. So for example, like DPRK sanctions and like China, Russia. So basically it shows the relationship between the two countries, and there are not like much data to have those kind of relationship affinity between nations. So I guess what I might have to do the same, but then I think for this kind of research, I see that probably qualitative case studies probably work more efficient and easier. So again, I'm in the middle of the process.
Great. So I will move down to Kai Malden, who says, thank you for the presentation. There's much discussion in Washington these days on the importance of supply chain cooperation and resilience, especially in semiconductors. What should multilateral cooperation look like concretely in practice? What other governments should the US engage with in such an effort? And isn't Taiwan an important player given its outsized importance in the production of leading edge chips? And that's actually, that last question is another one that, that Dean Calder referenced as well.
Thank you for a great question. So since the Biden administration has a top priority over multilateral cooperation, and we see that more trends of informal multilateral framework rather than formal multilateral institution. I think it's mostly or partially because of the reality when it comes to the geopolitical environment that, for example, take South Korea as an example, and there are many countries like South Korea. So to South Korea, United States is #1 security ally, but at the same time, China is their #1 trading partner, but also United States is #2 trading partner. So, so looking at a lot of countries who have the same arrangement, it might be challenging for the United States to establish formal multilateral framework. Having said that, the current government is working on establishing a lot of informal multilateral framework that I think should be, this is my view, I think should be very flexible and issue specific. And even countries like Japan, I think they find that it would be very difficult to have a comprehensive like partnership throughout the all issue area. So I see the trend that is more like focusing on issue specific, and probably like the way that we heard from President Biden's executive orders and focusing on 4 supply chains: rare earths, batteries, and semiconductors, and pharmaceutical, the medical industries. So, when it comes to your question, I'm sure you know that TSMC has announced to do a major investment to build the factory, the foundry in Arizona. So and as you can see, the major countries, it's South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Netherlands, and probably UK and the United States. So it might be possible to create informal committee or consultative body that can bring in both public and private sector and to start cooperation. But again, I think at the so this is the policy level. But what I can do on the research from the research level and to really contribute to existing research, I guess, because the current situation is evolving and continue to evolve. So I like to compare the cases that have happened a while ago, since probably the time that US and Japan dominated the semiconductor industry a while ago. But then right now we have different players. So while I'm conducting the previous research, and when the situation is moving forward, I can compare the 2 different incidences, I think, 2 different cases.
Before we move to the next question, what I wanted to follow up on the earlier part of your answer to the last question, which was, so when I speak with policymakers or interested parties in the region, and this is not just, say, East Asia or Northeast Asia, but really going all the way down to Southeast Asia as well. One of the questions, one of the more consistent statements that people make when we ask them for advice or feedback, or a sense of kind of how they see U.S.-China competition, interaction, coexistence in the region. One of the things that people say most consistently is, don't make us choose. And so I guess one part of the question is that, I think the answer is probably yes, just the way you're nodding your head. To what degree is that something that resonates in South Korea? But then the second thing is your suggestion of sector-specific engagement a way to thread that needle? And is that, are there other ways of possibly threading that needle as well?
Sure. Thanks for the fascinating question. So I have like a lot of stakeholders in partners, even in Southeast Asia, for my work, for my current work. And I also hear so much basically about their dilemma that they cannot make any choice between the 2 countries. And I think, and I hope that the current, the foreign policy team in the Biden administration have a very good understanding about the reality. And that's why I see this trend of like issue-specific, sector-specific approach. But number one, but fundamentally, basically, you has to show more presence in South China Sea. I think that's gotta be the precondition. Has to show U.S. President board, right, and participating like ASEAN summit, etc. But when it comes to sector specific, yes, I think it's totally possible. Although, and that doesn't mean it's gonna be easy. It's gonna be very challenging, but I think it's not impossible. And when we even look at the current US-China policy, it has three buckets: adversarial, competitive, and cooperative. So we see that it's going to be very, very tough and adversarial when it comes to anything related to values, human rights, and democracy. And we see a continuous trend of cooperation, like I said, in technology and trade and economic sphere. And we don't see much on cooperation, although we hear that climate change or DPRK could be the possible areas of cooperation. So because of the domestic political situation, I see that it's gonna be very challenging to do all the three buckets. But when it comes to, but if we nail down into specific sectors and issues, and which could be green energy or clean energy, and the way that I see the infrastructure bill, which includes also like project and bills for the electric vehicles and climate change. So I think clean energy would be a good leeway to bring in trusted partners to do something like electric vehicles again, and also yeah, that's what I see how this situation could be unfold, hopefully.
Yes, hopefully. Thank you. So I think we have time for two more questions. You had mentioned North Korea, and so getting back to your, to your presentation, John Kajin asks, is there any relevance whatsoever of North Korea to to the subject of your talk? Is it it seems to be the 600-pound gorilla in the room, and so what do we have to force some sort of a relevance to all of this, or is it really there as a kind of as a as a silent kind of mover or shaper of what's going on?
I think we have to see what the Biden administration's North Korea policy will be. So as I understand, the policy review is almost done, and it's going to announce its North Korea policy, and that's really will depend on like whether and how the involved country, and so basically US ROK would be able to continue its effort in terms of the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula or North Korea. And also, we see that there was a trilateral meeting between the National Security Councils here in Washington, D.C. area, to which the discussion also include DPRK partially. So the difference from the previous administration, it's involving more players, including Japan and also China. And I mean, if we have more time and maybe in a different setting, I also like to hear your views, Dean Mertha. But so it is without support of China, US wouldn't be able to achieve the level of denuclearization of the North Korea. But then given the current geopolitical landscape, is it possible to bring in support from China? And I think that is also important issue and factor. And also, like, what about Russia? We see that China and Russia, they're actually have been exercising like military, just joint military exercises over the sea, over the sea, West Sea. And so how we are going to all like take that into account, this DPRK effort. So I guess my simple answer is to wait for the policy review and how the current administration DPRK policy will be.
Sorry, I'm muted. So one last question, and it's kind of like a, you have maybe 30 seconds to answer a deeply complex question. So Dean Calder asks again about, what about the Russia ROK pipeline concept? energy flows overland between Russia and the ROK. And the reason why I'm interested in that question as well is when my parents are originally from Hungary, and when my father moved back to Hungary in the mid 1980s, I'd go visit him, once or twice a year, and it was usually around Christmas time, and that was always in the news in Hungary and around the surrounding countries. The question was always, is Russia going to manipulate supplies, and that was always, people were on pins and needles, kind of on an annual basis. And so I'm wondering, I don't want to kind of shape the answer, but with that, it's that lens through which I'm very curious about how you would respond to the question about such a pipeline. And of course, and then an offshoot of that would be, couldn't a pipeline, across the DPRK be used as a carrot in peace discussions as well?
Yes. Again, fascinating question, Dean Mertha. So there were times that we hear just much more about the possibilities of building pipeline coming from Russia. So it is like through the overland, like you said, and which has to transit North Korea. But once we know that North Korea is basically developing its nuclear capabilities, and we have to basically worry about all the potential scenarios of disruption. And because we don't want to actually encounter into the same situation like Ukraine, right? The disruption of energy supplies, and also as you all know, Korea's energy dependence is really like very, very, very high, and which will not change. So there's another discussion, so whether to build the undersea pipelines, which is also not easy because of the geographical location of South Korea. So China, Russia, and North Korea, and also again, US is the strongest, like South Korea's ally. So I guess, the prospects for building the pipeline, maybe not for the visible timeline, but I don't want to say that it's not really impossible. I hope that I hope to see that in my lifetime. And I guess that would be my answer. Thank you.
Well, one can always be hopeful. The old trope is that politics make strange bedfellows, and nowhere is that more the case than when we're talking about the Russia, China, North Korea axis. So I just want to thank Dr. Oh for a fascinating presentation and a stimulating discussion. I want to also thank Dean Yo for his remarks, for everybody at the SAIS IT team for doing such a wonderful job, to our attendees who have stuck it out until the bitter end. I think they will walk away knowing far more after an hour than they did at the start of the hour. And these are really ongoing conversations that are fascinating, relevant, and deeply complex, which is exactly kind of where I think is the soft spot, or the sweet spot rather, for those of us at SAIS and the way in which we see the world. So this was, I think, for me, extremely stimulating, and I imagine it has been for everybody else as well. So with that, let me conclude our program. And once again, thanks to Dr. Oh, and very much looking forward to further engagement with the work that you're doing, because it affects us all.
Thank you so much, Dean Mertha, and everyone for tuning in. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.